Hello there, dear listener, and welcome to this gentle journey through time. If you find yourself enjoying this quiet tale, do consider giving it a gentle thumbs up and perhaps subscribe for more soothing stories from history's pages. But for now, simply let yourself sink deeper into comfort. Our story begins in the year 1564, in the gentle market town of Stratford-upon-Avon, nestled in the heart of Warwickshire. Picture, if you will, a place where the river Avon meanders peacefully through verdant meadows, where church bells mark the passing hours with their ancient bronze voices, and where the scent of fresh bread mingles with the earthy smell of horses and hay. It was here, on what we believe to be the 23rd day of April, though some say the 26th, that little William Shakespeare drew his first breath. The England of 1564 was a land caught between worlds. Good Queen Elizabeth had been on the throne for 6 years, bringing stability after the tumultuous reigns of her predecessors. The medieval world was slowly giving way to something new and wonderful. The Renaissance was blooming like an early spring flower, bringing with it new ideas about art, learning, and what it meant to be human. Yet, in small towns like Stratford, life moved at the pace it had for centuries, marked by the seasons, the church calendar, and the gentle rhythms of rural existence. William's father, John Shakespeare, was a man of some standing in the community. He worked with leather, a glover they called him, crafting the fine gloves that gentlemen and ladies would wear. The smell of leather and the tools of the trade would have filled the Shakespeare household, along with the particular mustiness that comes from working with hides and the sharp tang of the various oils and treatments used in the craft. John was also a man who understood the value of civic duty. He served his community in various capacities, as an ale taster, ensuring the quality of the local brew, and later as a bailiff, essentially the mayor of this modest but prosperous town. Mary Arden Shakespeare, William's mother, came from slightly more elevated circumstances. The Ardens were an old family with roots that stretched back through generations of Warwickshire landowners. She brought to her marriage not only her gentle breeding, but also a small inheritance of land, precious in those days when land meant security, meant having a place in the great chain of being that ordered Elizabethan society. Mary would have known her letters, unusual for a woman of her time, and she likely passed this love of learning to her children. The house where young William spent his earliest years still stands today on Henley Street. Though much altered by the passing centuries, in the 1560s, it would have been a typical Tudor dwelling, timber framed with wattle and daub walls, the wooden beams dark with age and weather, small diamond-paned windows that let in precious light during the long English winters. The floors would have been of beaten earth or rough wooden planks, scattered with rushes that were changed seasonally to keep the house sweet-smelling. Fire was the center of domestic life, a great hearth where cooking was done, where the family gathered in the evenings, where stories were told and songs were sung. Imagine little William, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, watching the flames dance in that hearth while his mother told him tales passed down through generations. Stories of King Arthur and his knights, of Robin Hood and his greenwood, of fairies and spirits that lived just beyond the edge of the known world. These stories, absorbed in childhood by the light of flickering flames, would later bloom into the magnificent fantasies of A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest. The Stratford of William's youth was a thriving market town, its prosperity built on wool and leather, on the fertile farms that surrounded it, and on its position along the roads that connected London to the north. Market days would bring farmers and merchants, jugglers and peddlers, creating a tapestry of sound and colour in the town square. The young Shakespeare would have witnessed this weekly carnival of commerce and entertainment, absorbing the rhythms of different speech patterns, the cadences of various social classes, mixing together in the democratic chaos of the marketplace. When William was old enough, perhaps around the age of 7, he began his formal education at the King's New School, which had been established by royal charter in the previous century. The school stood near the Guild Chapel, its stone walls worn smooth by generations of students. Here, in rooms lit by tall windows and warmed by simple braziers in winter, The curriculum was rigorous by any standard, focused primarily on Latin, the language of learning, of the church, of all educated discourse. Young scholars would begin with the basics, learning to read and write in their native English, but quickly progressing to Latin grammar, rhetoric, and literature. They studied the great Roman authors, Ovid, whose Metamorphoses would later provide Shakespeare with countless plot devices and poetic images, Virgil, whose Aeneid offered models of epic storytelling, Cicero, whose speeches demonstrated the power of persuasive language. The school day was long, beginning at dawn and continuing well into the afternoon, with only brief breaks for meals. Discipline was strict. The master's birch rod was never far from hand, though we might hope that young William's quick wit and evident talent spared him many of its applications. The boys would recite their lessons aloud, the room filled with the musical sound of Latin verse being chanted in unison, the ancient words taking on new life in the voices of English school children. But perhaps more important than any formal lesson was what William absorbed simply by living in Stratford during these formative years. The town was on the circuit of travelling players, companies of actors who would arrive with their carts laden with costumes and props, transforming the inn yard or the guild hall into a magical theatre for a few precious hours. These performances were the movies and television of their age, bringing stories of kings and queens, of lovers and rogues, of heroes and villains to audiences hungry for entertainment. Picture young William watching these performances with wide eyes, seeing how a few actors with simple props and the power of language could transport an audience to ancient Rome or a distant kingdom. The magic of theatre, the willing suspension of disbelief, the way words and gestures could create entire worlds, must have taken root in his imagination during these early encounters. The 1570s were turbulent times in England, though perhaps this turbulence was felt less keenly in peaceful Stratford than in London or other major cities. The religious question, Catholic or Protestant, remained a source of tension throughout Elizabeth's reign. The old Catholic faith, with its Latin masses, its saints and relics, its elaborate ritual, had been officially replaced by the new Protestant Church, with its English services and simpler ceremonies. Yet many families maintained private loyalties to the old ways, while publicly conforming to the new. John Shakespeare's own religious inclinations are a matter of some historical debate, but there is evidence to suggest that he may have had Catholic sympathies. In the roof of the Shakespeare house, workmen in the 18th century discovered what appeared to be a Catholic spiritual testament, a document affirming faith in the old religion, possibly in John's handwriting. Whether this is authentic or not, it reminds us that the Shakespeare household existed in a world where religious and political loyalties were complex, where families had to navigate carefully between public conformity and private belief. This religious complexity would later manifest in Shakespeare's plays, which show a remarkable understanding of both Catholic and Protestant sensibilities. His works are filled with friars and nuns, with concepts of purgatory and salvation that reflect Catholic theology, yet they also demonstrate the Protestant emphasis on individual conscience and the direct relationship between the soul and God. This religious ambiguity, this ability to see truth and beauty in multiple traditions, may have been one of the gifts of growing up in a household where such questions were quietly contemplated. As William progressed through his school years, his father's fortunes began to change. John Shakespeare had been rising in the world, elected to various civic positions, accumulating property, even applying for a coat of arms that would have marked the family's ascent into the gentry. But sometime in the mid-1570s, this upward trajectory faltered. John began missing town council meetings, stopped paying his taxes, and even ceased attending church regularly, a dangerous omission in an age when religious conformity was monitored by the authorities. The reasons for this reversal remain mysterious. It might have been financial difficulties, perhaps bad investments or debts that had accumulated beyond his ability to pay. It might have been religious, a Catholic's reluctance to participate in Protestant services, or it might have been some combination of personal and professional setbacks that we can no longer reconstruct from the scanty historical records. Whatever the cause, This change in the family's circumstances must have made a profound impression on young William. The experience of seeing his father's status decline, of watching a man who had once been bailiff of Stratford reduced to avoiding his creditors and public obligations, would have taught the boy valuable lessons about the precarious nature of fortune, about how quickly circumstances can change, about the difference between appearance and reality. These themes, the wheel of fortune, the instability of worldly success, the gap between public face and private truth, would later become central to many of his greatest plays. Despite these family difficulties, William continued his education, though he probably left school earlier than he might have under different circumstances. By the time he was 14 or 15, around 1579 or 1580, he was likely finished with his formal schooling and beginning to think about his future. In those days, a young man had several options. He might follow his father's trade, he might be apprenticed to another craftsman, he might seek his fortune in London, or he might marry and settle down to raise a family in his hometown. For a time, it seems, William chose the last of these options. In November of 1582, when he was just 18 years old, he married Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years his senior from the nearby village of Shottery. Anne was the daughter of Richard Hathaway, a farmer of some substance, and she brought to the marriage not only her maturity but also, as it soon became apparent, a child already quickening in her womb. The marriage license, which still survives in the archives, tells us something of the haste with which the ceremony was arranged. There was only one reading of the banns instead of the customary 3, and the license was issued with unusual speed. Susanna Shakespeare, William and Anne's first child, was baptized in May of 1583, just 6 months after the wedding, a circumstance that would have raised eyebrows in that more judgmental age, though such premarital pregnancies were not uncommon among the working classes. Anne Hathaway Shakespeare remains one of the most enigmatic figures in the Shakespeare story. She left behind no letters, no diary, no direct record of her thoughts or feelings. We know she lived in a farmhouse in Shottery that still stands today, surrounded by gardens and fields, a place of rural tranquility. The house would have been comfortable by the standards of the time, larger than the Shakespeare dwelling in Stratford with its own orchard and outbuildings, speaking to the Hathaway family's solid yeoman status. What was Anne like? We can only imagine. Perhaps she was a practical woman, skilled in the domestic arts that kept a Tudor household functioning, brewing ale, baking bread, tending the garden, supervising the preservation of food for the long winter months. Perhaps she was literate, able to read the Bible and simple texts, though she probably could not write. This was common for women of her class and time. She would have been strong, used to physical labor, capable of managing a household and raising children while her husband was away. And William was away increasingly, as the 1580s progressed. In February of 1585, Anne gave birth to twins, Hamnet and Judith, named after Hamnet and Judith Sadler, close friends of the Shakespeare family. The choice of these names speaks to the web of relationships that bound the small community of Stratford together, where friendships were marked by such honors and where children grew up surrounded by honorary aunts and uncles who helped shape their characters. With 3 young children and a household to maintain, one might expect William to have settled permanently into domestic life, perhaps taking over his father's business, or establishing himself in some other trade. Instead, sometime in the late 1580s, we cannot be certain exactly when, he left Stratford for London, beginning the transformation from provincial young man to the most celebrated playwright in English history. The reasons for this departure are lost to history, though scholars have proposed various theories. Perhaps he was caught poaching on the lands of Sir Thomas Lucy, a powerful local magistrate, and fled to avoid prosecution. Perhaps he found work as a schoolmaster in a remote country district, and from there made his way to the capital. Perhaps he was simply drawn by the magnetic pull that London exercised on ambitious young men throughout England, the promise of opportunity, advancement, fame, and fortune that the great city represented. Whatever the immediate cause, we can imagine the difficulty of this decision: to leave Anne and the 3 children, to venture into an uncertain future in a city notorious for its dangers and temptations must have required considerable courage. London in the 1580s was a sprawling, chaotic metropolis of perhaps 200,000 souls, by far the largest city in England, a place where a countryman could easily lose himself in the maze of narrow streets and crowded tenements. The London that William Shakespeare encountered was a city in the midst of extraordinary transformation. The medieval city of narrow lanes and guild halls was giving way to something grander and more complex. New districts were springing up beyond the ancient city walls, great houses were being built along the Thames, and the river itself was crowded with boats of every description. Merchant vessels bringing goods from across the known world, wherries carrying passengers from bank to bank, royal barges decorated with silk and gold. The contrast with quiet Stratford must have been overwhelming, where Stratford's streets were familiar pathways where everyone knew everyone else. London's thoroughfares were rivers of strangers, merchants from Germany and Italy, sailors from dozens of countries, courtiers in velvet and silk, craftsmen, beggars, cut purses and prostitutes, all jostling together in a democratic chaos that would have been unimaginable in the provinces. The air itself was different, thick with smoke from thousands of hearths and workshops, tinged with the smells of exotic spices from the docks, heavy with the human aromas of a city where sanitation was primitive and privacy was a luxury few could afford. The sounds too were overwhelming, church bells marking the hours, street criers hawking their wares, the rumble of cartwheels on cobblestones, the shouts of watermen offering passage across the Thames, the general murmur of human voices speaking in dozens of different accents and languages. For a young man from the countryside, the sheer scale of London's theatrical world must have been revelatory. Where Stratford might see a troupe of travelling players once or twice a year, London supported multiple permanent theatre companies, each with their own playhouse, their own repertoire, their own following among the diverse audiences that made up the capital's population. The theatre, built by James Burbage in 1576, was the first purpose-built playhouse in England since Roman times. Located in Shoreditch just beyond the city walls and therefore outside the jurisdiction of London's rather stern city fathers, it established the model that other playhouses would follow. Picture a roughly circular wooden building, 3 stories high with an open courtyard in the centre where groundlings, the ordinary citizens who could afford only the cheapest admission, would stand during performances. Around this yard rose galleries where more prosperous patrons could sit on benches, and above them the most expensive seats where merchants and minor nobles could display their finery while enjoying the play. The stage itself projected into the yard, bringing the actors close to their audience, creating an intimacy between performer and spectator that our modern theatres, with their clear division between stage and auditorium, can barely approximate. There was no artificial lighting. Performances took place in the afternoon, using natural daylight, which meant that the audience could see each other as clearly as they could see the actors. The theatre was a democratic space where duchess and dairymaid might find themselves side by side, united in their response to the magic unfolding before them. It was into this vibrant, competitive, and sometimes dangerous world that young William Shakespeare made his entry, probably sometime around 1587 or 1588. We know frustratingly little about his first years in London. These are the so-called lost years about which scholars can only speculate. But we can imagine him learning his craft, perhaps starting as a hired man with one of the theatre companies, helping with costumes and props, prompting actors who had forgotten their lines, gradually working his way up to small acting roles, and eventually to the writing that would make his reputation. The life of a theatrical professional in Elizabethan London was precarious but potentially lucrative. The theatre companies operated under royal or noble patronage, which provided some protection from the authorities who were often suspicious of actors and their audiences. Yet this protection could be withdrawn at any moment, and plague outbreaks periodically closed all the theatres, sending the companies on tour through the provinces to keep body and soul together. Competition between the companies was fierce, and successful playwrights were always in demand. Audiences were sophisticated and demanding. They wanted new plays regularly. They expected high standards of poetry and dramaturgy, and they were quick to show their displeasure if a performance disappointed them. A playwright who could reliably provide crowd-pleasing material, who understood the capabilities of different actors, who could write across multiple genres with equal facility, could expect to prosper. By the early 1590s, William Shakespeare was beginning to make his mark in this competitive environment. His earliest plays, the three parts of Henry VI, perhaps the Comedy of Errors, possibly Titus Andronicus, were finding audiences and establishing his reputation. These were apprentice works in many ways, showing the influence of other contemporary dramatists, experimenting with different styles and subjects, but already displaying flashes of the genius that would later blaze so brilliantly. The Henry VI trilogy demonstrated Shakespeare's interest in English history and his ability to transform the sometimes dry chronicles of the past into compelling drama. These plays dealt with the War of the Roses, that bitter dynastic conflict that had torn England apart in the 15th century before the Tudors brought stability. For Elizabethan audiences, these historical dramas served multiple purposes. They provided entertainment, they offered lessons about the dangers of political disorder, and they implicitly celebrated the peace and prosperity that Elizabeth's reign had brought to England. But it was not only as a playwright that Shakespeare was making his reputation. The plague outbreak of 1593 to 1594 closed London's theatres for many months, forcing him to seek other sources of income. During this period, he turned to narrative poetry, publishing Venus and Adonis in 1593. These poems, based on classical mythology and written in elaborate, rhetorically sophisticated verse, were aimed at a more elite audience than his plays, and were immediately successful. Venus and Adonis in particular became something of a sensation among young gentlemen about town. The poem tells the story of the goddess Venus's passionate pursuit of the beautiful youth Adonis, combining mythological narrative with sensuous description and psychological insight. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated, slightly risque entertainment that appealed to educated readers who wanted to demonstrate their classical learning and their appreciation for fine poetry. The success of these poems established Shakespeare not merely as a purveyor of popular entertainment, but as a serious literary artist capable of working in the most prestigious forms of the day. The narrative poems required different skills from playwriting: a more sustained poetic voice, elaborate rhetorical devices, careful attention to meter and rhyme scheme, and the ability to develop character and plot through pure description rather than dialogue and action. That Shakespeare excelled in both dramatic and non-dramatic forms speaks to the remarkable range of his talents. When the theatres reopened in 1594, Shakespeare found himself in an enviable position. He became a founding member of a new theatrical company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, named after their patron Henry Carey, the first Baron Hunsdon, who served as Lord Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth. This was no ordinary business arrangement. Shakespeare was not merely an employee but a shareholder in the company, entitled to a portion of the profits and having a voice in the company's artistic and business decisions. The Lord Chamberlain's Men quickly established themselves as one of London's premier theatre companies. Their leading tragedian was Richard Burbage, son of James Burbage, who had built the theatre, and widely regarded as the finest actor of his generation. It was Burbage who would first embody many of Shakespeare's greatest tragic heroes: Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, bringing to life with his voice and presence the complex characters that existed first only in the poet's imagination. The company also included Will Kempe, a famous comic actor known for his improvisational skills and his ability to connect with the groundlings. Kempe specialized in the rustic clowns and foolish servants that were staples of Elizabethan comedy, though his tendency to ad-lib and extend his comic business sometimes frustrated playwrights who had carefully crafted their scenes. Later, Kempe would be replaced by Robert Armin, a more subtle performer whose skills better suited the wise fools and melancholy jesters of Shakespeare's mature comedies. Picture the life of a successful playwright and actor in 1590s London. Shakespeare would have spent his days in rehearsal working with the company to prepare new plays and revive old favourites. The pace was relentless. Theatre companies performed 6 days a week, presenting a different play each day, maintaining a repertoire of dozens of works that could be mounted at short notice. New plays were constantly being added to this repertoire, and old ones revised and updated to keep audiences interested. The process of creating a play was highly collaborative. Shakespeare would write with specific actors in mind, tailoring roles to their particular strengths and abilities. He would work closely with the company's shareholders to choose subjects that would appeal to their audiences, and he would participate in the business decisions that determined everything from costume purchases to touring schedules. The financial arrangements were complex but potentially very rewarding. As a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's men, Shakespeare received a portion of the company's profits in addition to payments for his individual plays and his work as an actor. When the company performed at court, which happened regularly, as Queen Elizabeth was fond of theatrical entertainments, the payments were particularly generous, and the prestige of royal approval helped attract audiences to the public theatres. It was during the middle years of the 1590s that Shakespeare's distinctive voice as a playwright began to emerge with full clarity. Romeo and Juliet, probably written around 1595, showed his mastery of both comedy and tragedy, his ability to create characters who spoke with individual voices while serving the larger patterns of the plot, his gift for language that could be both beautiful and psychologically revealing. The play tells a story that was already well known to Elizabethan audiences, the tale of young lovers whose passion is destroyed by their family's ancient enmity, had been told by several previous authors. But Shakespeare transformed this familiar material into something entirely new, creating characters of extraordinary psychological complexity and surrounding them with a world that feels completely real and lived in. Consider the famous balcony scene where Juliet appears at her window and Romeo, hidden in the garden below, overhears her soliloquy. In less skilled hands, this might have been merely a pretty scene of young love. But Shakespeare uses it to explore the tension between public identity and private feeling, the way that language itself can be both a barrier and a bridge between souls, the mixture of innocence and sophistication that characterizes adolescent passion. The language of the scene moves effortlessly between the elevated and the intimate, between classical allusion and colloquial speech. When Juliet asks, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet," she is engaging with philosophical questions about the relationship between language and reality that had fascinated Renaissance thinkers. Yet she does so in language that feels natural and unforced, the kind of thing an intelligent young woman might actually say while wrestling with the implications of loving someone her family considers an enemy. The play's success established Shakespeare as more than just another competent dramatist. Here was a playwright who could satisfy the groundlings' desire for excitement and spectacle, while also providing the kind of linguistic and psychological sophistication that educated audiences demanded. The sword fights and family feuds provided action and suspense, while the poetry and character development offered more subtle pleasures for those capable of appreciating them. During this same period, Shakespeare was also developing his skills as a writer of comedy. A Midsummer Night's Dream, probably composed around 1595 or 1596, represents perhaps the perfect fusion of all the elements that made Elizabethan comedy so appealing. The play weaves together multiple plot lines: the courtship of Theseus and Hippolyta, the romantic confusions of 4 young Athenians, the domestic discord between Oberon and Titania, and the amateur theatrical endeavours of Bottom and his fellow mechanicals. The setting, a wood outside Athens where fairy magic transforms perception and desire, allowed Shakespeare to explore themes of love, identity, and the relationship between reason and passion in a context where anything might happen. The fairies, drawn from English folk tradition rather than classical mythology, created a sense of wonder and possibility that transported audiences from the familiar world of everyday experience into a realm where transformation was not only possible but inevitable. Bottom the Weaver, given an ass's head by the mischievous Puck, and beloved by the fairy queen Titania, while under the influence of a magic potion becomes a figure of both comedy and pathos. His transformation is ridiculous, yet there is something touching about his good-natured acceptance of his bizarre situation, his simple pleasure in being the object of royal attention, even if that attention is the result of supernatural manipulation. The play's famous speech about the nature of theatre, Theseus' reflection that the best in this kind are but shadows and the worst are no worse if imagination amend them, reveals Shakespeare's sophisticated understanding of his own medium. Theatre depends upon the audience's willingness to collaborate in the creation of meaning, to use their imagination to transform the simple materials of costume, gesture, and language into complex emotional and intellectual experiences. As the 1590s progressed, Shakespeare's reputation continued to grow. He was becoming not merely a successful playwright, but a cultural figure of real significance. The publication of his narrative poems had established his credentials as a serious poet, while his success in the theatre demonstrated his understanding of popular taste and his ability to create commercially viable entertainment. His history plays, in particular, seem to capture something essential about the English national spirit during these years of increasing confidence and international prominence. Richard III, with its charismatic villain protagonist, showed how political evil could seduce even as it horrified. The play's Richard is a monster responsible for the murder of children and the destruction of anyone who stands in his way. Yet he is also witty, intelligent, and possessed of a self-awareness that makes him oddly sympathetic. This complexity, the ability to create characters who resist simple moral categorization, was becoming a hallmark of Shakespeare's mature work. His villains are rarely purely evil, his heroes seldom without flaws, his comic characters often touched by melancholy, his tragic figures frequently capable of humor even in their darkest moments. This psychological realism, this recognition that human beings are composed of contradictory impulses and conflicting loyalties, set his work apart from that of his contemporaries, and helps explain why his plays continue to speak to audiences across cultures and centuries. The prosperity that came with theatrical success allowed Shakespeare to turn his attention to his family's status and his own long-term security. In 1596, he successfully applied for a coat of arms for his father, finally achieving the gentlemanly status that John Shakespeare had sought years earlier. The motto chosen for the family arms was non sans drogt, not without right, perhaps a subtle assertion that the Shakespeare family's rise in the world was based on merit rather than mere luck or favour. Tragically, that same year brought personal sorrow that would shadow much of Shakespeare's later work. His son Hamnet died at the age of 11, leaving behind his twin sister Judith and his older sister Susanna. The cause of Hamnet's death is unknown. It might have been plague, which regularly swept through English towns, or any of the childhood diseases that were so often fatal in an age before effective medical treatment. The loss of his only son must have been devastating for Shakespeare, both personally and practically. In a society where male inheritance was crucial for the continuation of family name and property, Hamnet's death meant that the Shakespeare line would likely end with William himself. The boy had carried his father's hopes for the future. The possibility that the family's newly acquired gentility might be passed down through generations. Some scholars have suggested that grief over Hamnet's death influenced the composition of Hamlet. Written probably around 1600 to 1601, the similarity of the names Hamnet and Hamlet is unlikely to be coincidental, and the play's preoccupation with fathers and sons, with death and memory, with the difficulty of moving forward after profound loss, may reflect the playwright's own emotional struggles. But grief, however profound, did not diminish Shakespeare's creative powers. If anything, the late 1590s and early 1600s represent the peak of his artistic achievement. During this period, he wrote some of his greatest comedies, Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, works that combine sophisticated wit with genuine emotional depth, that explore the complexities of human relationships with both humor and compassion. Much Ado About Nothing, with its contrasting pairs of lovers, demonstrates Shakespeare's mature understanding of the different forms that romantic attachment can take. Claudio and Hero represent young love that is passionate but fragile, easily shaken by suspicion and misunderstanding. Beatrice and Benedick, by contrast, embody a more mature relationship based on intellectual equality and mutual respect, though it too must overcome pride and fear of vulnerability before it can flourish. The play's treatment of the theme of appearance versus reality, so central to much of Shakespeare's work, is particularly sophisticated. Nearly every character in the play engages in some form of deception or role-playing. Yet these deceptions sometimes reveal truth more clearly than direct honesty might. When Beatrice and Benedick are tricked into believing that each loves the other, the trick succeeds precisely because it awakens feelings that were already present but suppressed. As You Like, it takes this exploration of identity and transformation even further, setting much of its action in the Forest of Arden, a pastoral retreat from the corruption and complexity of court life. Here, characters are free to experiment with different versions of themselves, to explore possibilities that would be foreclosed in the more rigid social environment of the ducal palace. Rosalind, one of Shakespeare's most appealing heroines, disguises herself as a young man, and in this disguise is able to test Orlando's love while also exploring her own feelings and desires. The gender confusion that results. A boy actor playing a girl who pretends to be a boy creates layers of theatrical meaning that must have delighted sophisticated playgoers, while also providing simple comedy for less intellectually inclined audiences. The play's famous speech about the 7 ages of man, all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, reflects Shakespeare's mature understanding of human life as a series of performances, of roles that we play with varying degrees of conviction and success. Yet the speech is delivered by Jacques, the play's professional melancholic, whose cynicism is ultimately shown to be incomplete and one-sided. The play as a whole affirms the value of human connection and the possibility of genuine happiness, even while acknowledging the theatrical nature of social existence. Twelfth Night, probably the last of the great romantic comedies, pushes the themes of identity and desire to their logical extreme. Viola, shipwrecked and alone in a foreign country, disguises herself as a young man and finds herself caught in a tangle of misdirected affections. She loves Duke Orsino, who believes her to be a man, and uses her as a go-between in his courtship of Lady Olivia, who falls in love with Viola in her masculine disguise. The emotional complexity of this situation, Viola's pain at being unable to express her true feelings, Olivia's confusion at finding herself attracted to someone she believes to be a man, Orsino's gradual recognition that his page evokes feelings he doesn't fully understand, creates a bittersweet undertone that distinguishes this comedy from Shakespeare's earlier, more purely celebratory works. The play's subplot, involving the gulling of the pompous steward Malvolio, introduces a darker note that hints at the psychological cruelty that would become more prominent in the later plays. Malvolio's humiliation, while providing comic entertainment, also raises questions about the ethics of entertainment itself, about the point at which harmless fun becomes genuine malice. Sir Toby Belcher's defence of revelry. Dost thou think, because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale? Might stand as a motto for the comic spirit itself, the principle that life should include pleasure and festivity alongside duty and moral seriousness. Yet the play also shows the limitations of this philosophy, the way that thoughtless pursuit of amusement can cause real pain to others. As the 16th century drew to a close, Shakespeare found himself in an increasingly secure position. The Lord Chamberlain's men had established themselves as the premier theatrical company in London, regularly performing at court and maintaining a loyal following among all levels of society. Shakespeare's dual role as playwright and shareholder meant that his income was substantial and relatively reliable, at least by the standards of his profession. In 1597, he made a purchase that symbolized his success and his continuing connection to his Stratford roots. He bought New Place, the second largest house in Stratford-upon-Avon, a substantial dwelling with gardens and outbuildings that marked his family's definitive arrival among the local gentry. The house, which no longer stands, was built of brick and timber, with multiple chimneys and large windows that would have proclaimed its owner's prosperity to anyone passing by. This purchase represented more than just a sound investment or a comfortable retirement home. It was a statement of identity, a declaration that despite his success in London's competitive theatrical world, William Shakespeare remained at heart a Stratford man, connected to the community that had shaped his earliest years. The house would serve as a retreat from the pressures of London life, a place where he could reconnect with family and old friends, where he could observe the quieter rhythms of provincial existence that continued to influence his imagination. Yet, even as he established this connection with his birthplace, Shakespeare was entering the most intensely creative period of his career. The turn of the century brought with it a new mood in English culture, a shift away from the confident optimism of the early Elizabethan years towards something more complex and troubled. Queen Elizabeth was aging, and the question of succession, unresolved despite decades of speculation, cast a shadow over public life. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and introspection that Shakespeare began writing the great tragedies that represent perhaps his finest achievement. Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth. These plays explore the darkest possibilities of human experience while maintaining the psychological complexity and linguistic brilliance that had characterized his earlier work. But before we follow Shakespeare into these darker territories, let us pause for a moment to appreciate the world he had created for himself by the year 1600. Here was a man who had risen from provincial obscurity to become one of the most celebrated artists of his age, who had transformed himself from the son of a struggling glover into a gentleman with his own coat of arms and a substantial house in his hometown. He had achieved this transformation through the power of language, through his ability to understand and express the full range of human experience, through his gift for creating characters and situations that spoke to the deepest concerns of his contemporaries, while transcending the particular circumstances of his own time and place. The London that Shakespeare knew at the dawn of the new century was a city pulsing with energy and ambition, yet also shadowed by awareness of mortality and change. The great queen who had ruled for more than 4 decades was visibly aging, her face painted with the white lead and vermilion that could not entirely disguise the ravages of time. The court that had once sparkled with youthful vitality now had about it something autumnal, a sense of an era drawing to its close. In the playhouses, audiences seemed hungry for more complex fare, stories that acknowledged the darker currents beneath the surface of human experience. The simple certainties of earlier decades, the clear distinctions between good and evil, the confidence that virtue would ultimately triumph, the faith that England's destiny was guided by divine providence. These comfortable assumptions were giving way to more troubling questions about the nature of existence itself. It was into this shifting cultural landscape that Shakespeare introduced Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, sometime around 1600 or 1601. The play tells an old story. The tale of a prince who must avenge his father's murder had been told before, most notably in an earlier play that may have been Shakespeare's own first attempt at the subject. But in Shakespeare's hands, this familiar revenge plot became something unprecedented, a profound meditation on consciousness itself, on what it means to be human in a universe that offers no clear guidance about how to live. From its opening scene on the battlements of Elsinore, where sentries strain their eyes through the Danish darkness watching for the ghost of the dead king, Hamlet creates an atmosphere of uncertainty and dread. The ghost, when it finally appears, brings not comfort but confusion, demanding revenge while refusing to provide clear proof of its accusations. Is it truly the spirit of Hamlet's father, or some demonic presence seeking to damn the prince's soul? The play never definitively answers this question, leaving both Hamlet and the audience to wrestle with the implications of acting on uncertain knowledge. Hamlet himself represents a new kind of tragic hero, one whose greatest battles are fought not on external battlefields, but within the confines of his own consciousness. His famous soliloquies, "To be or not to be," "What a piece of work is a man," or interior monologues, that lay bare the workings of a mind grappling with fundamental questions about existence, mortality, and moral responsibility. Picture the young Richard Burbage embodying this complex character, standing alone on the stage while the theatre fell silent around him, every spectator hanging on his words as he explored the landscape of human doubt and determination. The soliloquies work on multiple levels simultaneously. They advance the plot by revealing Hamlet's thoughts and intentions. They provide moments of poetic beauty that transcend their dramatic function, and they invite the audience into an intimate relationship with the character's inner life. The play's treatment of madness, both Hamlet's assumed antic disposition and Ophelia's genuine mental breakdown, reflects contemporary fascination with the fragility of human reason. In an age when the boundaries between sanity and madness were poorly understood, when melancholy was considered both a medical condition and a mark of intellectual sophistication, Hamlet's psychological complexity resonated with audiences who recognized in him their own struggles with uncertainty and self-doubt. Ophelia's mad songs, filled with fragments of ballads and folk tales, represent some of the most hauntingly beautiful poetry in all of Shakespeare's work. Her flowers, rosemary for remembrance, pansies for thoughts, rue for repentance, create a symbolic language that speaks directly to the emotions even as her rational speech dissolves into confusion. The contrast between her earlier articulateness and her final broken utterances provides one of the theatre's most powerful illustrations of the mind's vulnerability to overwhelming grief. The play's famous play within a play scene demonstrates Shakespeare's sophisticated understanding of theatre's relationship to reality. When Hamlet stages the mouse trap to test Claudius's guilt, he creates a moment where the boundaries between performance and life become deliberately blurred. The actors perform a story that mirrors the actual events at Elsinore, while the court audience watches unaware that they are themselves being watched and judged. The scene becomes a meditation on the nature of truth itself, on the way that art can sometimes reveal what direct confrontation cannot. Following the success of Hamlet, Shakespeare continued to explore the darkest possibilities of human experience in a series of tragedies that remain unmatched in their psychological penetration and poetic power. Othello, probably written around 1603 to 1604, takes as its subject the destructive power of jealousy, showing how a noble mind can be corrupted by manipulation and self-doubt. The play's protagonist, a Moorish general in Venetian service, represents something relatively new in English drama, a tragic hero whose outsider status is central to his vulnerability. Othello's position in Venetian society is secure but precarious. His military prowess has earned him respect and advancement, but his racial difference makes him perpetually suspect, always required to prove his loyalty and worth. Iago, his ensign, represents perhaps Shakespeare's most chilling creation, a villain whose motivations remain deliberately obscure, whose evil seems to spring from a fundamental hatred of goodness itself. Unlike Richard III, whose villainy serves his ambition for power, Iago appears to be motivated by nothing more than a desire to destroy innocence and happiness wherever he finds it. The play's domestic setting, much of the action takes place in private chambers and intimate spaces, creates a claustrophobic atmosphere that intensifies the psychological drama. Where Hamlet ranged across castles and graveyards, battlements and throne rooms, Othello focuses on the bedroom where the marriage of Othello and Desdemona is both consummated and destroyed. The tragic irony of the final scene, Othello's murder of his innocent wife based on fabricated evidence, represents one of theatre's most devastating illustrations of how love can be perverted into its opposite. King Lear, written probably in 1605 to 1606, presents perhaps Shakespeare's bleakest vision of human existence, a world where the gods seem either absent or actively malevolent, where children turn against parents and parents reject children, where madness and suffering appear to be the only constants in human experience. The play interweaves two plots, the story of King Lear and his three daughters and the parallel tale of the Earl of Gloucester and his two sons, to create a comprehensive examination of family relationships gone wrong. Lear's decision to divide his kingdom based on his daughter's public declarations of love sets in motion a chain of events that destroys not only his own family but the entire social order. The play's treatment of madness is even more complex than Hamlet's. Lear's descent into mental chaos, Edgar's assumed madness as poor Tom, and the fool's wise folly create a spectrum of different relationships between reason and unreason. The storm scene, where the mad king rages against the elements while his fool and the disguised Edgar provide commentary, represents one of the most powerful theatrical images of human vulnerability in the face of cosmic indifference. Yet, even in this darkest of plays, Shakespeare finds moments of transcendent beauty and human connection. The reconciliation between Lear and Cordelia, brief though it is, suggests that love and forgiveness remain possible even in the midst of universal suffering. Edgar's care for his blind father, Gloucester, and Albany's attempt to restore some measure of justice at the play's end indicate that while the world may be harsh and uncertain, human beings retain the capacity for compassion and moral action. Macbeth, probably written around 1606, explores themes of ambition and guilt in a Scottish setting that would have pleased King James I, who had recently ascended the English throne. The play's supernatural elements, the three witches who prophesy Macbeth's rise to power, the ghost of Banquo, the apparitions that provide false comfort, create an atmosphere where the natural and supernatural worlds interpenetrate in disturbing ways. The relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth provides one of Shakespeare's most psychologically complex portraits of marriage. Their initial partnership in crime, Lady Macbeth's manipulation of her husband's ambition, their shared guilt over Duncan's murder, gradually dissolves as the consequences of their actions isolate them from each other and from their own better natures. Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene, where she attempts to wash imaginary bloodstains from her hands, represents one of the most vivid theatrical embodiments of guilt ever created. Her fragmented speech, "Out, damned spot, here's the smell of the blood still," suggests a mind that has been fractured by the weight of its own knowledge, unable to find peace or forgiveness. The play's treatment of sleep as a metaphor for peace and innocence. Sleep no more, Macbeth does murder sleep, reflects the way that evil actions contaminate not only the present but the future, making restoration and healing impossible. Macbeth's final soliloquy, where he reflects that life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury signifying nothing, represents one of literature's most powerful expressions of existential despair. During this period of intense creative activity, Shakespeare's personal life continued to be divided between London and Stratford. The demands of the theatre kept him in the capital for much of the year, but he maintained his connection to his hometown and his family. His father, John Shakespeare, died in 1601, finally at peace with his creditors and his community. His mother, Mary Arden Shakespeare, continued to live until 1608, long enough to see her son established as one of England's most celebrated artists. The theatrical world itself was undergoing significant changes during these years. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth died, and James I ascended the throne, bringing with him a different aesthetic sensibility and a more complex court culture. The Lord Chamberlain's men became the King's men, reflecting their new royal patronage, and their status as the premier theatrical company in England was further confirmed. The company's success enabled them to make a significant business decision in 1608. They acquired the lease to the Blackfriars Theatre, an indoor playhouse that catered to a more elite audience than the outdoor theatres like the Globe. The Blackfriars was smaller and more intimate than the public theatres, with artificial lighting that allowed for more subtle effects and a clientele that was willing to pay higher prices for more sophisticated entertainment. This change of venue influenced Shakespeare's later plays, which show an increased interest in spectacle and music, in special effects that would have been impossible in the outdoor theatres. The romances of his final period, Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, The Tempest, make extensive use of mask-like elements, supernatural appearances, and elaborate staging that suggest they were written with the Blackfriars' capabilities in mind. But before we examine these final plays, it's worth considering the position Shakespeare occupied in London's cultural landscape by around 1608. He was now in his mid-40s, no longer the ambitious young provincial seeking his fortune in the capital, but an established figure whose reputation extended far beyond the theatrical world. His plays were regularly performed at court, his narrative poems continued to be reprinted and celebrated, and his name had become synonymous with poetic excellence and dramatic innovation. Yet success had not made him complacent or comfortable. The great tragedies demonstrate his continued willingness to explore the most challenging aspects of human experience, to confront questions that had no easy answers, to create art that disturbed as well as entertained. This combination of commercial success and artistic integrity is perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Shakespeare's career, his ability to satisfy popular taste while never compromising his vision or settling for easy effects. The London he inhabited was itself changing. The old medieval city was giving way to something more recognizably modern: wider streets, better sanitation, more sophisticated architecture. The population continued to grow, drawing people from across England and Europe, creating a cosmopolitan environment where different cultures and traditions mingled and influenced each other. The intellectual life of the city was equally vibrant. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge were producing educated men who came to London seeking opportunities in government, law, and literature. The printing industry was flourishing, making books more widely available than ever before. Scientific inquiry was beginning to challenge traditional assumptions about the natural world, while exploration of the Americas and other distant lands was expanding English understanding of human diversity and possibility. It was in this stimulating environment that Shakespeare continued to develop his craft, absorbing influences from classical literature, contemporary European drama, folk traditions, and the rich vernacular culture of London's streets. His plays reflect this cosmopolitan awareness. They are set in Italy and Denmark, France and Scotland, ancient Rome and mythical kingdoms, yet they remain unmistakably English in their sensibility, their humour, and their understanding of human nature. The success of the King's Men during this period was remarkable by any standard. They performed regularly at court, particularly during the Christmas season when the king and his courtiers sought entertainment during the long winter evenings. These court performances were lucrative and prestigious, providing the company with financial security and social recognition that elevated them above the level of mere popular entertainers. At the Globe Theatre, their public performances continued to draw audiences from all levels of society. The afternoon performances created a unique social environment where aristocrats and apprentices, merchants and students, housewives and courtesans might find themselves sharing the same space, responding to the same stories, laughing at the same jokes, moved by the same tragic moments. This democratic aspect of Elizabethan and Jacobean theatre, its ability to bring together people who would normally be separated by rigid social hierarchies, may help explain the enduring power of Shakespeare's plays. They were written for audiences that included both the highly educated and the barely literate, both those who understood classical allusions and those who responded primarily to action and spectacle. This breadth of appeal required a special kind of genius, an ability to work on multiple levels simultaneously without sacrificing coherence or artistic integrity. As Shakespeare entered what would prove to be the final phase of his theatrical career, something remarkable happened to his artistic vision. The dark pessimism of the great tragedies began to give way to a different kind of wisdom, one that acknowledged suffering and loss while still affirming the possibility of redemption and renewal. The plays of this period, often called the late romances or the last plays, represent not a decline in his powers, but a transformation, a movement toward a more philosophical and ultimately more hopeful understanding of human existence. Pericles, Prince of Tyre, probably written around 1607 to 1608, marks the beginning of this transition. The play tells the wandering story of a prince who suffers great losses: the apparent death of his wife in childbirth, the presumed loss of his daughter, only to be reunited with both through the workings of providence and time. The play's episodic structure, spanning many years and covering vast geographical distances, creates a sense of life as a long journey filled with both tragedy and unexpected grace. The figure of Gower, the medieval poet who serves as the play's narrator, provides a bridge between past and present, suggesting that the stories we tell ourselves about suffering and redemption are as old as human memory itself. His gentle, archaic verse creates an atmosphere of timeless wisdom, of truths that transcend the particular circumstances of any individual life. The reunion scene between Pericles and his daughter Marina, who has grown to womanhood believing herself an orphan, represents one of Shakespeare's most moving explorations of the theme of lost and found. The moment when Pericles realizes that this young woman is his long-lost child creates a theatrical epiphany that seems to heal not only the character's wounds, but something deeper in the fabric of existence itself. Cymbeline, written probably around 1609, continues this exploration of forgiveness and reconciliation, though in a more complex and politically charged context. Set in ancient Britain during the reign of a king who must navigate between Roman imperial demands and British independence, the play weaves together multiple plot lines involving disguise, betrayal, apparent death, and ultimate restoration. Imogen, the play's heroine, represents one of Shakespeare's most appealing late characters, a woman of unshakable integrity who maintains her essential self despite being subjected to extreme trials. Her journey, which takes her from the court to the Welsh mountains, from princess to page boy, from despair to joy, embodies the play's larger theme of identity preserved through transformation. The play's final scene, where all the various deceptions and misunderstandings are resolved, requires extraordinary theatrical skill to manage convincingly. Shakespeare orchestrates revelation after revelation. Imogen's true identity, the survival of Cymbeline's lost sons, the exposure of the villain Iachimo's deceptions, in a cascade of recognitions that could easily become ridiculous, but instead creates a sense of cosmic justice, finally asserting itself. The Winter's Tale, written around 1610 to 1611, represents perhaps the most successful integration of tragic and comic elements in all of Shakespeare's work. The play's first half presents what appears to be a straightforward domestic tragedy. King Leontes' jealous conviction that his wife Hermione has been unfaithful to him, with his childhood friend Polixenes, leads to the apparent death of Hermione and the abandonment of their infant daughter. Yet, the play's second half, set 16 years later, transforms this tragic material into something approaching fairy tale. The abandoned daughter Perdita has grown up as a shepherdess and fallen in love with Polixenes' son Florizel. Their love story, played out against the background of a sheep-shearing festival filled with music and dancing, creates an atmosphere of rural innocence and natural harmony that seems to promise the healing of old wounds. The play's most famous stage direction, Exit, pursued by a bear, occurs at the moment when Antigonus, who has been charged with abandoning the infant Perdita, is killed by a bear after leaving the child on the coast of Bohemia. This moment, which could be either terrifying or comic depending on how it's staged, epitomizes the play's unique tonal balance, its ability to acknowledge the reality of death and suffering while maintaining faith in life's regenerative powers. The final scene, where Hermione's statue comes to life and she is reunited with her repentant husband and her grown daughter, creates one of theatre's most powerful images of resurrection and forgiveness. Whether we interpret Hermione's return literally, as a miracle of divine grace, or symbolically, as the power of love to transcend even death, the scene affirms that some losses can be restored, some wounds can be healed, some broken relationships can be mended. The Tempest, probably written in 1611, and likely Shakespeare's last solo-authored play, brings these themes of forgiveness and reconciliation to their fullest expression. Set on an enchanted island where the exiled Duke Prospero has spent 12 years perfecting his magical arts, the play presents a world where supernatural power is used not for revenge but for education, and ultimately for mercy. Prospero's magic allows him to control the other characters' experiences, to create illusions that reveal truth, to orchestrate events that lead his enemies toward repentance and his daughter toward love. Yet the play makes clear that this magical power is not an end in itself, but a means toward a higher goal, the restoration of justice and harmony in the human community. The relationship between Prospero and Ariel, his spirit servant who longs for freedom, adds another layer to the play's exploration of power and responsibility. Ariel's songs, "Come unto these yellow sands," "Full fathom 5 thy father lies," create some of the most beautiful lyrical moments in all of Shakespeare's work, yet they are always in service to Prospero's larger design. The play's treatment of Caliban, the island's original inhabitant who has been enslaved by Prospero, raises complex questions about colonialism and cultural encounter that seem remarkably prescient given the play's early 17th century composition. Caliban's famous speech about the island's natural beauty, "Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not," reveals a poetic sensibility that complicates any simple moral judgment about his character or his relationship with Prospero. The mask scene, where spirits perform an elaborate entertainment for Miranda and Ferdinand, represents the kind of courtly spectacle that would have been particularly effective in the intimate setting of the Blackfriars Theatre. The combination of music, dance, costume, and poetry creates a moment of pure theatrical magic that serves both as entertainment and as a symbol of the harmony that art can create when it serves the cause of human happiness. Prospero's famous speech about the dissolution of the mask, "Our revels now are ended, we are such stuff as dreams are made on," has often been interpreted as Shakespeare's own meditation on the nature of theatre and perhaps his farewell to the dramatic art that had been his life's work. The image of actors and audiences, plays and playhouses, all dissolving into thin air, captures something essential about the theatre's unique combination of substance and illusion, permanence and transience. The play's ending, where Prospero renounces his magical powers and prepares to return to the world of ordinary human experience, suggests that the highest achievement of art is not to escape from reality, but to transform our understanding of it. The reconciliation between Prospero and his brother Antonio, though imperfect and perhaps incomplete, represents the best that human beings can achieve, not perfect justice, but the possibility of forgiveness and new beginning. During these final years of his theatrical career, Shakespeare's personal circumstances were also changing. By 1610 or 1611, he seems to have been spending more time in Stratford, though he maintained his financial interests in the King's Men and continued to receive income from their success. The purchase of additional property in Stratford, including the Blackfriars Gatehouse in London, which he bought as an investment, indicates that he was thinking seriously about his long-term financial security. His family relationships during this period remained somewhat mysterious. His wife Anne, now in her 50s, had managed the household and probably supervised his business interests in Stratford during his long absences in London. His daughter Susanna had married Dr. John Hall, a respected physician, in 1607, and in 1608 she gave birth to Shakespeare's first grandchild, Elizabeth Hall. This continuation of the family line must have provided some compensation for the loss of his son Hamnet more than a decade earlier. His younger daughter Judith remained unmarried until 1616, when she wed Thomas Quiney, a vintner whose family had been friends with the Shakespeares for many years. The marriage seems to have been somewhat hasty and may have involved some family disapproval, as it took place during Lent without the proper ecclesiastical license, resulting in the couple being cited by the church court. The Stratford that Shakespeare returned to during his final years had changed considerably since his youth. The town was more prosperous than it had been in the 1580s, with new buildings and improved roads reflecting the general economic growth of Jacobean England, yet it remained essentially the same close-knit community, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where reputation and social standing mattered enormously, where the rhythms of life were still largely determined by the agricultural seasons. Shakespeare's own position in this community was now unassailable. He was one of the town's wealthiest residents, a gentleman with his own coat of arms, a successful man who had made his fortune in the wider world but had chosen to return to his roots. The boy who had left Stratford as an ambitious young man seeking his fortune had returned as a figure of considerable local importance. Yet even in retirement, Shakespeare continued to be involved in the theatrical world. The King's Men still performed his plays regularly, and new works continued to appear that bore his name, though some of these, such as The Two Noble Kinsmen, probably written in collaboration with John Fletcher, show clear signs of collaborative authorship. Fletcher, who was about 20 years younger than Shakespeare, was emerging as one of the leading dramatists of the new generation, and his partnership with the aging master suggests a graceful transition from one theatrical era to another. The London that Shakespeare was gradually leaving behind was itself in the midst of significant change. James I's court was more learned and sophisticated than Elizabeth's had been, but also more expensive and more remote from popular concerns. The gap between court and country, between elite and popular culture, was widening in ways that would eventually contribute to the political tensions that led to civil war in the 1640s. The theatrical world was also evolving. The old-fashioned history plays and romantic comedies that had been so popular in the 1590s were giving way to more sophisticated city comedies and darker, more psychologically complex tragedies. New playwrights like Ben Jonson, John Webster, and Thomas Middleton were exploring subjects and techniques that pushed the boundaries of what theatre could achieve, while the audience itself was becoming more segmented, with different playhouses catering to different social classes and aesthetic preferences. In this changing landscape, Shakespeare's achievement looked increasingly monumental. He had helped create the professional theatre as a serious artistic medium, had written plays that appealed to both popular and elite audiences, had demonstrated that English drama could equal the greatest achievements of classical antiquity. His influence on younger dramatists was already apparent, and his plays continued to be revived and celebrated long after their initial runs. But perhaps more important than his influence on other writers was his impact on the English language itself. Shakespeare's vocabulary was enormous. His complete works contain more than 25,000 different words, many of them neologisms or new applications of existing terms. Phrases and expressions that he coined or popularized have become so embedded in English that we use them without thinking of their origin. Wild goose chase, in a pickle, break the ice, heart of gold, neither here nor there, and hundreds of others. His characters, too, had become part of the cultural imagination in ways that transcended their original theatrical contexts. Hamlet's melancholy, Falstaff's wit, Lady Macbeth's ambition, Romeo and Juliet's passion. These figures had achieved a kind of mythological status, representing fundamental aspects of human nature that people recognized and identified with across cultural and temporal boundaries. As 1616 began, Shakespeare was probably aware that his health was declining. He was 51 years old, which was not particularly advanced age by modern standards, but was approaching old age by early 17th century measures. The life expectancy for someone of his social class was probably around 60, though many people died much younger from diseases that are now easily treatable. In January of 1616, he began the process of drawing up his will, a document that provides our most detailed glimpse into his financial circumstances and family relationships at the end of his life. The will reveals a man of substantial wealth. His estate was worth probably around £300, a considerable sum that would have placed him among the more prosperous residents of Stratford. The document also reveals something about his family dynamics. The bulk of his estate was left to his daughter Susanna and her husband Dr. Hall, with provisions made for his younger daughter Judith and her new husband Thomas Quinney. To his wife Anne, he left only his second-best bed, a bequest that has puzzled and sometimes amused scholars for centuries, though it probably represented a sentimental rather than a slight, as the second-best bed would have been the marital bed, the best bed being reserved for guests. The will mentions various friends and colleagues, including small bequests to his fellow actors John Heminges, Richard Burbage and Henry Condell, the men who would later edit and publish the first folio of his plays. These modest gifts suggest continuing affection for his theatrical colleagues, though they also indicate that his primary concerns at the end of his life were with his family and his local community, rather than with the London theatre world that had made his reputation. Winter gradually gave way to spring in Stratford-upon-Avon, and with the warmer weather came the annual cycle of planting and renewal that had marked the seasons of Shakespeare's childhood. The River Avon flowed past the town as it always had, carrying with it the snowmelt from the distant hills, reflecting the lengthening days and the gradually warming sun. In New Place, the substantial house that symbolized his worldly success, William Shakespeare passed his final weeks surrounded by family and friends. We know little about his last illness. Some sources suggest it may have been related to a fever contracted after drinking too heavily with fellow poets, though this may be mere legend. What seems certain is that his end, when it came, was relatively peaceful, the natural conclusion to a life that had been extraordinarily full and productive. On April 23, 1616, possibly his 52nd birthday, certainly the anniversary of what we believe to have been his birth, William Shakespeare died in the house where he had hoped to spend his remaining years in comfortable retirement. The date seems almost too symbolic to be true, as if the playwright's life were itself a perfectly constructed drama, beginning and ending on the same day of the year, the cycle complete and harmonious. The funeral took place 2 days later, on April 25th, at Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, the same church where he had been baptized 52 years earlier. The burial service would have been conducted according to the rites of the Church of England, with prayers and psalms that spoke of resurrection and eternal life, of dust returning to dust while the soul found peace with its Creator. He was buried in the chancel of the church, near the altar, a position of honor that reflected his status as a gentleman and a substantial contributor to the church's maintenance. The grave was marked by a simple stone slab bearing a verse that may have been his own composition, a curse upon anyone who might disturb his bones. Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. The verse reflects both the practical concern that graves were sometimes disturbed to make room for new burials, and perhaps a deeper anxiety about posthumous reputation, about whether the work that had consumed his adult life would survive his death. Within a few years of his death, that question began to be answered in ways that would have astonished even Shakespeare himself. His fellow actors John Hemingers and Henry Condell, loyal friends from the King's Men, undertook the enormous task of collecting and publishing his plays in a single volume. The first folio, published in 1623, preserved 36 plays that might otherwise have been lost forever, ensuring that future generations would be able to experience the full range of Shakespeare's dramatic genius. The folio's dedicatory verses, written by Ben Jonson, captured something essential about Shakespeare's achievement and his likely legacy. He was not of an age, but for all time, Jonson wrote, recognizing that his colleagues' work transcended the particular circumstances of its creation to speak to universal human concerns. As news of the publication spread, readers and playgoers began to recognize that something extraordinary had been preserved. Here were not just entertainments of a particular historical moment, but works of art that seemed to contain within themselves the full range of human experience: love and hatred, ambition and resignation, wisdom and folly, comedy and tragedy, all expressed in language of unprecedented beauty and psychological penetration. The quiet market town of Stratford-upon-Avon gradually came to understand that it had been home to one of the greatest artists in human history. Visitors began to come, first in small numbers, then in ever-increasing crowds, seeking to understand how such genius could have emerged from such ordinary circumstances, how the son of a glover could have created works that spoke to kings and commoners, scholars and illiterates, across all the boundaries that normally divide human beings. The house in Henley Street, where he had been born, became a place of pilgrimage. The cottage in Shottery where Anne Hathaway had lived became a shrine to their courtship. Holy Trinity Church, where he lay buried, attracted visitors who came to pay their respects to the man whose imagination had populated the world with unforgettable characters and whose language had enriched human expression beyond measure. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to William Shakespeare was not any physical monument or building, but the continuing life of his plays themselves. In theatres around the world, actors continued to speak his lines, audiences continued to be moved by his stories, students continued to discover in his works new depths of meaning and beauty. Each generation found in Shakespeare something different, something that spoke to their particular concerns and circumstances. The Romantics discovered in him a kindred spirit who celebrated individual passion and natural beauty. The Victorians found moral instruction and uplifting sentiment. The 20th century saw in him a modern consciousness struggling with alienation and existential uncertainty. The 21st century continues to find relevance in his exploration of power and politics, love and betrayal, the complexity of human motivation and the difficulty of moral choice. This adaptability, this capacity to speak to different ages and cultures in their own language while maintaining his essential identity, may be the clearest mark of Shakespeare's genius. He created works of art that were both of their time and beyond it, rooted in the particular circumstances of Elizabethan and Jacobean England, yet capable of transcending those circumstances to achieve universal significance. And so, our gentle journey through the life of William Shakespeare draws to its close here in the quiet churchyard of Stratford-upon-Avon, where he has rested for more than 4 centuries. The river Avon still flows past the town, carrying with it the reflections of seasons that come and go with eternal regularity. The half-timbered houses still stand, though much altered by the passage of time. The market square still hosts its weekly gatherings, though the goods sold and the people who gather have changed beyond recognition. Yet something essential remains: the human capacity for wonder, for imagination, for the kind of deep empathy that allows us to recognize ourselves in characters who lived and loved and suffered in distant times and places. This capacity, which Shakespeare understood and celebrated better than any writer before or since, continues to unite us across all the boundaries that seem to divide us. As you settle into sleep tonight, dear listener, perhaps you might carry with you some small portion of the wonder that filled William Shakespeare's life and work. Perhaps you might remember that language itself is a kind of magic, capable of creating entire worlds, of making the absent present and the past alive, of connecting heart to heart across the centuries. Thank you so very much for accompanying me on this long, leisurely journey through the remarkable life of England's greatest poet. I hope that these quiet hours we've shared together have brought you some measure of peace and perhaps renewed appreciation for the power of human creativity and the enduring beauty of well-chosen words. May your sleep be gentle and restorative, filled with dreams as rich and various as the characters who populate Shakespeare's plays. May you wake refreshed and ready to engage with your own story, your own possibilities, your own capacity for love and growth and creative expression. Sleep well, dear friend, and good night.